if there are neither beginnings nor endings to the turning of the wheel of time, does that also mean there can be no origins? Well, maybe there can be an origin. 6, in fact. Let's talk about them. Welcome to the Pop Docs channel. My name is Joseph. I am one half of the Pop Docs here with a video about the Wheel of Time, specifically talking about the Origins episodes. And if you are a Wheel of Time fan, whether you have been reading the books, have read the books far in the past, or you are a newcomer to the franchise, to the fandom, because you discovered the television adaptation, it is a wonderful time to be a Wheel of Time fan. As I am recording this video, we are only a few short weeks away from season 2 of the Wheel of Time, but we don't only get the general episodes for season 1 and soon to be season 2 of the Wheel of Time. We've also been given Origins episodes. These are 3-minute long animated sequences that really help to expand on the world building in the Wheel of Time. And they address different aspects, different features of, at the moment, aspects of season 1, as the 6 Origins episodes we have access to currently debuted along with season 1. And so in many ways they supplement different elements from season 1. But in anticipation of season 2, I wanted to rate and rank the Origin episodes from my point of view, how they struck me, what I think of them, and how they ultimately relate not only to the Wheel of Time generally, but also how they rank against one another. And I have to say, before jumping into the Origins episodes and how I'm going to rank them, that is the criteria I use to try to better understand and rate and rank these 6 different Origins episodes. One of the things that I love about the Wheel of Time series is the intricate and detailed world that Robert Jordan created. This multifaceted, multicultural, very distinctive world, both in the present timeline of the general story, but also the depth that he built into this world going back centuries, if not even millennia. And we saw a little bit of this, a little introduction to this, in the 8th episode of season 1 from the cold open, where we had Luz Theron Telamon talking with Latro Posey, debating, arguing over how best to address the problem of the Dark One from the perspective of the Aes Sedai. At the end of that scene, we pan out from Luz Theron's residence, and we see this very futuristic sci-fi setting out there in the world. And I think this is just one reflection. I don't think it's going to be the only time we have a flashback to millennia prior to the main storyline. I believe that particular cold open is said in the show to have occurred 3,000 years before the events of the current show. And I think we're going to get more of these types of flashbacks in future seasons. I certainly think we'll get at least one in this upcoming season, but I loved the fact that they included that element in the show because it really demonstrates the depth and richness of the world that Robert Jordan created, both in the present as well as in the past, and given the dynamics of the world, the future as well. And so I'm glad that the showrunners, the creators, are leaning into that element of the world building of the Wheel of Time in the show proper. Now, certainly given time constraints, possibly given budget constraints, given the narrative imperatives of the stories, both in book form and the necessary efforts to translate the written word into the visual medium through the television show, they can't include everything in these particular episodes and still make them entertaining and have a narrative pace that people can enjoy. And so a lot of the world building either needs to be sprinkled into different elements throughout the seasons that the Wheel of Time runs, or you have ancillary material help to fill in some of the gaps that there's just not enough time to delve into in the show proper. And that's really where I think the Origins excel. Because I think the Origins, I'm sure this was in many ways the impetus for creating these Origins episodes, was to try and fill in those world building gaps that really enrich the world of Wheel of Time, but that would potentially drag down or distract from the main storylines that are going forward and being depicted in the live action show. And so I really enjoyed each of these Origins episodes, some more than others, as we'll get into in this particular video. But I really love the fact that the showrunners, Amazon, the collaboration between them, whoever decided to also create and produce these Origin episodes, I think it was a great decision on the part of the creatives, and I really do think they enrich the experience of the Wheel of Time. And so for viewers of this video that have not actually gone and seen these Origin episodes, I definitely recommend that you do so, and definitely recommend that you do so before continuing on in this particular video. I'm going to try and keep spoilers to a minimum. There will likely be spoilers for season 1 of the Wheel of Time, possibly for some elements of the book. So if you're concerned about spoilers, be warned now that I might get into or accidentally drop some spoilers as I walk through and discuss each of these Origins episodes. But given the fact that they are really delving into the history and the lore of this particular world, it's difficult in many ways to not talk about spoilers, particularly spoilers that might relate to season 1 of the Wheel of Time. As I began by saying, these seemingly supplement season 1, and they debuted alongside season 1. So, with those caveats, with those disclaimers now offered, let me jump into first my criteria as I approached, analyzed, and then ultimately rated these 6 Origin episodes. And I had 3 different dimensions upon which I rated these Origins episodes. First is what I label as presentation. And this certainly is a visual medium. It is a form of entertainment. And so I have a dimension where I analyze, at least for me personally, was this particular short feature really entertaining, really gripping? Was I on the edge of my seat? Was I bored? All these different factors, the aesthetics of the particular Origins episodes and how they worked for me or didn't work for me. And ultimately, before going any further, when it comes to presentation, I do want to put out there, this has nothing to do with the animation style of these Origins episodes, because I loved the animation style that was employed across all of these different episodes. I thought it brought a lot of dynamism to many of these. I thought it was unique from other kind of animated features, particularly in the fantasy realm that I had seen relatively recently. And I think it really captured the tone and the setting of the Wheel of Time, particularly the tone and the setting of the specific anecdotes that these Origin episodes were focused upon. And so the presentation is not going to involve any kind of critique or comment on the animation style. I think the animation style is top-notch, and I would love to see that implemented in future Origins episodes if Amazon and the creative team is going to continue to produce these Origin episodes. So great job on the animation. But having said that, I think the other elements of these Origins episodes vary. Second dimension I have on which I rated these Origins episodes, the interest that I personally had in the subject matter of each Origin episode. So there's a lot of different terms, different locations, different elements of history, the political context, the cultural context of this particular world that was depicted and expressed in season 1 of the Wheel of Time. And so there was a lot of different stories or anecdotes or eras that the creators of Origins could have focused upon and expanded upon. And as we'll see here in this video, my interest level in the subject matter of these Origins episodes varied in different ways. But that's my second dimension here that I have for my rating system, my second piece of criteria. The third and final is how informative these Origins episodes are or were. And I try to and evaluate this through the perspective of a non-book reader and see whether or not these Origins episodes make sense in conjunction with the live action series, whether I get enough of the historical context of each of these Origins episodes, having not had that background of the books, coupled certainly with whatever kind of context is inferable from the live action series as well. And so even though I can never really put myself completely back in the realm or the perspective of a non-reader, I still try to analyze in this video how informative these Origins episodes are for non-book readers, because ultimately I think that is one of the main reasons for creating and producing these Origins episodes, is to really give non-book readers that depth of lore and history that undergirds the Wheel of Time series, both in book form as well as in television form. So those are my 3 dimensions, my 3 criteria upon which I'm going to rate, and then ultimately through my rating, rank each of these 6 Origins episodes. And in keeping with other rating systems I have on the channel, particularly the rating system I employ in reviewing books predominantly, I'm going to have a score out of 10 for each of these 3 dimensions. I'll then add up the score on each dimension for each episode, and then that will give me my ultimate ranking. But with all of that out of the way, let us jump into specifically, substantively, these Wheel of Time Origins shows. Wheel of Time Origins, Episode 1, The Breaking of the World. And this, generally speaking, is a explanation as to how we can go from the futuristic science fiction environment and context with literal flying cars in the cold open of episode 8 to the present timeline in the show, where it's more of a Renaissance type of feel. Certainly a society that has not gotten near the technological level as we see in that cold open in episode 8. And it all stems from the corruption of the male half of the One Power by the Dark One, as this Origins episode explains, as well as how Moraine's monologue at the outset of season 1 talks about as well, and how this corruption came to be, the taint on the One Power came to be, and how that then led male channelers to go mad and then turn their usage of the One Power, their channeling, against those they loved, against cities, against the world itself, remaking the world due to the horrors inflicted on a rampant and indiscriminate and severe usage of the One Power. And so I think this Origins episode does a good job really explaining, but also depicting the devastation that was wrought due to the breaking of the world. And in such a way that you can easily understand how you go from that futuristic cityscape to this kind of more rural element in the Two Rivers, as an example, and then certainly seen when you go to the more cosmopolitan areas, it still is nowhere near the technological level that we see in that episode 8 cold open. So from a presentation perspective, I rated this as a 9. I thought the visuals were really interesting, really fantastic in a devastating sense, because they actually show in this Origins episodes to how the usage of the One Power in this way actually rent the world apart in different ways and led to complete and utter devastation of societies and actually remaking the physical nature of the world as well. And so not only was it very dynamic in its presentation, I thought it did a really good job conveying the horrors of the breaking of the world, and also setting the groundwork for why there may be so many in individuals and communities, societies, kingdoms, what have you, in the present timeline who are not only skeptical of male channelers and those claiming to be the Dragon Reborn, but outright afraid of those individuals. And it also helps to explain in greater detail, in my view, why the Red Aja not only exists, but also their raison d'etre for trying to, in essence, police the usage or the occurrence of the one power, particularly those that have access to the male half of the one power, because of the potential devastation that could emerge if those individuals fall into madness and then by virtue of their madness start discharging the one power in such a way that it leads to another breaking of the world. And so because there is this cold open in episode 8 that shows us this more futuristic landscape, but yet we spent all this time outside of that realm, I think interest in this particular Origins episode is at its height here. I actually scored it a 10 because I think it's imperative that we understand how those two things can exist in the same story, on the same world, even though they are at different times, and how we can go from a futuristic landscape to a less technologically advanced context. And so interest at its height at a 10. And the way that they depict this information, I think, is really effective. And it does bolster and support and expand in many ways on what we get in the live action show, particularly Moiraine's monologue at the beginning of the season. So I also gave it, in terms of its informative nature, a 10 as well. So really enjoyed this particular Origins episode. I think it's really important that they produce this Origins episode, and I would definitely recommend it to those that haven't seen this Origins episode to check it out, because I think it really addresses a key element of the world building that links the past with the present. And so I certainly highly recommend it. Interestingly, though, I did want to read off one piece of dialogue from this Origins episode that I found really interesting, and it goes as follows. This is the narrator speaking seemingly to novices. And so the conceit of this narration seemed to me to be an Aes Sedai lecturing, teaching history to novices or accepted those trained to become Aes Sedai. And so this particular line of dialogue appears at the end of the Origins episode. And it says, "For those of you destined to take the shawl, it would be among the most sacred of duties as an Aes Sedai to protect the world from another such breaking." I wrote in my notes here, this seems to be Red Aja propaganda, because this really seems to suggest all Aes Sedai have a responsibility to police the corruption and the taint of the One Power, which certainly in the books is really the province of the Red Aja and not the other Ajas. And I think we get a lot of that also in the show. And in fact, after Moiraine's monologue, we get a group of Red Aja Aes Sedai chasing down a male channeler who's gone mad, and seemingly, although it's off-screen, gentling him and cutting him off from the source. But the way this line reads to me is that this is almost a tenet of all Aes Sedai, is that they all share this obligation. So that is my one drawback from this particular Origins episode, because I think that's a little too broad. And I don't know if every Aja would perceive their responsibilities in that way. But perhaps I'm incorrect. If you think and you interpret this line differently, please jump in the comments below. Let me know how you receive that, how you heard that line, and how you think it plays into the overarching world building surrounding the Aes Sedai. But let's move on to the second Origins episode. This is another really good one. This is the Fall of Manetheren. And this is actually depicting the final death blows to the kingdom of Manetheren. We hear about Manetheren in, I believe, episode 2, when the Emmonsfield Five start singing a song, Weep for Manetheren, as they're traveling away from the two rivers, trying to avoid Trollocs and Myrgel, who are chasing after them. And then Moiraine launches into a retelling of the story of Manetheren, which is the old kingdom that existed where the two rivers now sits in the current timeline of the story. And Manetheren was a very powerful kingdom in the past that stood against the Shadow. And ultimately, they were able to withstand the forces of the Shadow, the forces of the Dark One, for several days, but ultimately succumbed in the end and were overrun by the forces of the Shadow. The king died. The queen, who could channel, actually unleashed an incredible amount of power, decimating the forces of the Shadow, the forces of the Dark One, that were assaulting the kingdom of Manetheren, but ultimately the kingdom fell to ruin, fell to myth and legend, and was in some sense lost to time as down the road the two rivers sprouted up in its place. Presentation, top notch. This was my favorite of the Origins episodes, particularly in terms of the presentation. And the animation did such a great job, I thought, building the atmosphere, building the tension, really creating this dark, foreboding sense of doom that awaited the king and queen and people of Manetheren. And then actually depicted some of the battle and the viciousness and the violence and the horror that occurred during the battle, leading to the fall of Manetheren, and then ultimately transitioning from this kingdom to this more agrarian society in the two rivers. And so from a presentation perspective, top notch, best score I can give it. I gave this particular one a 10. In terms of interest, I gave this a 5, very middle of the pack. Why? Because I think Moraine's description and her telling of the story is actually very interesting and more entertaining. Just the way that Rosamund Pike portrays it, recreates it, tells it is just so captivating. And because we had that in the show proper, this to a certain degree felt a little superfluous. I mean, it was still interesting content. It was engaging content for me as a Wheel of Time fan, because I will, generally speaking, look up, watch, enjoy any Wheel of Time content that is produced. But for those that are non-book readers or kind of casual fans of the Wheel of Time, you basically get the same story just in animated form and over 2.5 minutes long. So it's certainly worth a watch, given how short it is. It's not a huge time commitment. None of these are huge time commitments. But in terms of interest, I don't think it really advances the world building to a great degree. Like I said, it very much is just retelling in a different way, in a different format, the fall of Manetheren that we get in spoken form from Moraine in the show. And so that's why I gave it a 5 out of 10 for interest. Give it a little more in terms of informative, because I think it really demonstrates how dangerous the Dark One and the Dark One's forces ultimately can be. We get a little bit of that in the show so far, especially with the assault on the two rivers during Winter Night. We can see how vicious and terrifying Trollocs in particular are. We get a little bit of the Murdral, but ultimately they then fade off into the background. Those seem more kind of like advanced forces or small forces. In this particular Origins episode, they really demonstrate, and they do so in that limited time, how just dangerous, deadly, and vast these armies of Trollocs and Murdral can be if allowed to expand, if allowed to invade the Westlands and ultimately initiate, what I believe they are going with, which in the book series, the Trolloc Wars, this gigantic battle between the forces of the Dark One and the forces of the Light, if you will. We see what ultimately could happen if the Dark One and the Dark One's agents are successful in rebuilding their army and then ultimately invading Randland in the current show. And so that's why I think in terms of information, I think it does really expand in that regard, the actual threat posed specifically by the Dark One, because we're going to get several antagonists, particularly in Season 2, we're going to get a lot of the Shan-Chan, it looks like, based upon the trailer, a lot of the marketing materials. And so we're going to get more than just the Dark One and the Dark One's agents as antagonists in this show, just as it is in the books. And so I think in terms of informing the audience of the true terror and danger that can potentially be lurking out there due to the Dark One and the Dark One's forces, I think this particular Origins episode does a good job depicting that. One thing I did dock it on in terms of information is I didn't catch anywhere in the Origins episode the general context of the battle and the war. And other than it's just the forces of the Dark One combating the forces of Manetheren. And so I think that they could have done a little bit more and actually given a little bit more of the context of like, what is the war going on? Is this the only kingdom under siege by the Dark One? And so that also kind of feeds to a certain degree into the interest, because I think we get a little more of that from Moiraine's story in the show than we do in the Origins episode. Nevertheless, really like this one. This is one of my favorite Origins episodes that they produce. So I still recommend it for readers and non-readers alike if you're interested and want more Wheel of Time content. But let's move on to episode 3 of Wheel of Time Origins. This is The Greatest Warder. And so we get a lot of warder action, mainly in episodes 4 and 5 of the first season. In fact, once the main group goes into the Waygates on their way to Faldera, the warders very much become an afterthought. They fade far to the background, even to the point where Lan spends episode 8 just walking through the Blight, following Moiraine and Lan, and not doing much of anything. So we get a little more warder action in the Wheel of Time Origins episodes with this third episode. This is about warders training, and then ultimately one of the advisors, one of the teachers, informing the warders in training about the greatest warder and how the greatest warder was ultimately bested by a farmer with a stick. I imagine this is foreshadowing for what we will see or are likely to see in season 2, where Mat goes up against Gawain and Galad, maybe just Gawain, with a quarterstaff, and ultimately, presumably in the show, just like in the book, will defeat Gawain and Galad, or just Gawain, in that combat. Probably in the warder pit under the supervision of teachers and advisors of warders. And so get some good foreshadowing there. I liked that element of it. But outside of that, the visuals I didn't think were anything interesting. It was largely just warders training in different ways. The teacher, the advisor, looking over a field of warders training. This kind of weird, smoky, misty area where the story depicted the greatest warder being defeated by the farmer with the stick. Nothing too exciting, nothing too groundbreaking. Certainly nowhere near the dynamism and the pacing and the urgency of the first 2 episodes of the Wheel of Time Origins. So ultimately, I gave this a very low rating as it pertains to its presentation. I gave it a 2 out of 10. Interest, I gave it a 1. And again, these are really my perspective, from my point of view, didn't really have any interest. No, I don't think warders were that interesting in the sense of who they are kind of as an institution. We get essentially what they are in the show, that they are not only bonded to Aes Sedai, that they have this incredibly close, intimate relationship with their particular Aes Sedai, but they're there to protect them. They're there to fight in a martial way and defend their Aes Sedai. And I think that really just gives you the general idea of this institution of warders. And we see a lot of competent warders, again, particularly in episodes 4 and 5. We get a very emotional story about what happens when a warder's Aes Sedai dies through the eyes and the life of Stepan, which I thought was really well done in the show. And so you get a lot of the background, the perspective, the emotions of these individuals, of the warders in the show. And so I personally think this kind of was a wasted Wheel of Time Origins episode. That is to say, if we only were going to get 6 Origins episodes, there are a lot of other topics that were addressed in season 1 of the Wheel of Time that I think would have been better suited for the Wheel of Time Origins. I'll give you one that actually comes from episode 5. There's a scene in episode 5 where Stepan has a collection of little statuettes that he tells the audience, tells Lan, are representations of the Forsaken. That, I believe, is the only reference we get to the Forsaken in season 1. Certainly, spoilers here, we see a Forsaken in season 1. We get a Shamael in episode 8 predominantly, although obviously we see a Shamael with his fire eyes mask on at different points earlier than that. And we do get a reference for those that have seen the Dark Friends Social preview scene that's now available on Amazon for season 2. Shamael actually refers to him and his colleagues as Forsaken, and then also Chosen. And so we're starting to get a little more of the Forsaken and the Chosen. We also know that Lanfear has been cast, and we see Lanfear in the trailer to Season 2 of The Wheel of Time. So we're expanding on the Forsaken and the Chosen. All that is to say, I think Episode 3, rather than focusing on Warders, because we get so much of Warder content, if you will, in Episodes 4 and 5 of the show, I think a better focus would have been on the Forsaken or the Chosen. This would not only have given the audience, particularly non-book readers, an understanding of what the term Forsaken even means, who these people are, but also you could go back and give us some of the world building from eras past. The Age of Legends, that these were powerful channelers in the Age of Legends that chose to join the Dark One for a variety of reasons. I don't even think you would have to, in that Origins episode, name any of the Forsaken. You could have them all as silhouettes and just talk in very general terms that there were incredibly powerful Aes Sedai who chose to join the Dark One, were then labeled the Forsaken, and then were imprisoned in Shaiel Ghul, the Dark One's prison, whatever they want to call it in the show, only to ultimately potentially be broken out, allowing them to emerge back into the world at some later date. And so that would have given a better understanding just in general terms of who the Forsaken are, the threat they potentially pose, to demonstrate also that in eras past, in the Age of Legends, channelers, generally speaking, were much stronger than channelers are in the current timeline. And then just give us a little something, a little snippet about the Age of Legends as well. And so ultimately, I just think this was not a very interesting Origins episode. I gave it a 5 for informative, because it gives a little bit of a backstory of kind of historical figures of the Warders, generally showing what they're doing, their training. I think I was a little generous on that particular dimension, because ultimately I think this is certainly for me the lowest rated Origins episode for these various reasons. So let's move on then to the next one. Leave the Warders behind for the moment. The fourth one is Saidin Saidar Stone. And this is, again, the conceit of the narration is an Aes Sedai teaching novices and accepted about the One Power, and also how to access Saidar in particular. And so I mentioned here in my notes that we actually get a reference to the Age of Legends. So we get a little bit of what I was hoping for in Episode 3 of the Wheel of Time Origins. I just think it's a better fit in many ways if they were to go down the path of trying to explain, again, in very general terms, who the Forsaken are, who the Chosen are, whatever term they would want to use. But we do get a reference to the Age of Legends, how the channelers work together, certainly before the corruption, before the taint on the One Power. But then it also goes into talking about the potential differences between the different parts, the different halves of the One Power. It was okay in a presentation style. It was very much, as the conceit suggests, a lecture on the One Power, how to channel it, particularly from one perspective, given the dynamics, given the characters in the Wheel of Time Origins episodes, which is all fine, all make complete sense. It just was a 5 out of 10 for me, only because I was comparing it to particularly the first two Wheel of Time Origins episodes, The Breaking of the World and The Fall of Netheryn. Those were just so action-packed, dynamic, urgent, paced really well for the particular format of these Origins episodes. So really it's a 5 out of 10 only because I just like those first two episodes more. But I think in terms of interest, this should be ranked high. I have an 8 out of 10 because we don't get a lot of discussion or explanation of the One Power, generally speaking, what's going on, what the limits are of channeling. We get some hints, particularly in terms of the male half of the One Power, about the madness, the corruption, the taint, and its impact, largely through the figure of Logain and Logain's storyline in Season 1. So we get those types of limits, or at least not limits per se, but consequences for utilizing that half of the One Power. Outside of that, I felt like, at least for the Aes Sedai, Egwene, and Nynaeve, yes, we understand there are some weaves that heal. There are some weaves that cause explosions. There are some weaves that can open waygates. But there's really no explanation or indication of limitations for the channeling of the One Power, or even what's possible with the One Power. It basically was a narrative tool to move the plot forward, that if they needed to get into a waygate, for example, they can use the one power to open the waygate. Still not sure why they didn't have Loyal open it. He was there. It's neither here nor there. Ultimately, I just don't think in the show they do a good job in the first season of really explaining what is going on with the magic system. And I think this, therefore, is an interesting Wheel Time Origins episode because it expands upon that. And I think it's an important lecture, if you will, that we get in this Wheel Time Origins episode so we have a better sense of what's going on and what the one power is, how it manifests, what that means for different users of the one power. And so that's why I gave it such a high rating on the interest dimension. And then I think it's really informative for non-book readers in particular. So as a book reader, I had a general sense of what was going on without having necessarily to need an explanation as I'm describing. But for non-book readers, I rank this as a 9 out of 10 because I think this gives a lot of background information that really helps to flesh out and explain just very general dynamics of the magic system. And yes, it doesn't get into specifically the limits of these different aspects of the one power or the boundaries on the other end of the one power, what is possible. I also like that it kind of gives you an idea of what the training to become an Aes Sedai might be like, what it might be like to be in an Aes Sedai class at the White Tower. And ultimately, I should say, this is very much a rating system through not only the prism, obviously, of the Origins episodes, but how they also link up with what we've gotten so far, which is only Season 1. I do imagine that with Season 2, we know that Nynaeve and Egwene are going to go to the White Tower and begin their training to become Aes Sedai. And Nynaeve is going to go through accepted tests. We're going to meet Elaine. We saw Elaine in the trailer. And so I think we're going to get more explanation. I think we're going to see scenes like that depicted in this 4th episode of the Wheel Time Origins in Season 2. Because that certainly, narratively, is the right place to be getting those types of scenes as Nynaeve and Egwene and Elaine are learning to wield the one power. And so I think we're going to get more of this. But without having seen those episodes, seen Season 2, I can't incorporate that necessarily into my rating system. Nevertheless, because I think this adds on and expands generally the idea of the one power, the scope of the one power, what it is, in very, again, foundational terms, I gave this a high rating on the informative element of this Wheel Time Origins episode. Gave it a 9 out of 10. Moving then to episode 5, which is about the White Tower. And we get a lot of the White Tower in Season 1. Although, as I talk about in my reaction video to the Season 2 trailer, it felt like the White Tower is very small in the interior. We only got a couple hallways, a couple rooms, the Hall of the Sitters. The only Aes Sedai we really saw outside of the Hall of the Sitters scene, and the scenes in the hall with the Amerlin seat, Swan, were the Aes Sedai we met in episode 4. And so, for me, I felt like that world was very small, the way it was depicted in the show. I hope, possibly with a bigger budget, with a greater focus, we'll get more of that, of the White Tower, more Aes Sedai, more novices, more accepted in Season 2. And we're going to really see and feel the epic quotient of the White Tower in this upcoming season. But because of those different dynamics, I loved this Wheel Time Origins episode. We got some scope, expanded scope of the White Tower in this particular episode. I love the scene of the Aes Sedai, who I believe is meant to be the Amerlin seat at a particular time, not Swan Sancha, I don't believe, in the Wheel Time Origins. But walking down this long corridor where there are murals of the different Ajas, and centered around what their raison d'etre generally are. And it's this scene where we get a description from the narrator as to the differences among the different Ajas, which I think is awesome, because I don't think we get a great explanation in the first season as to the differences. We get implicitly a lot of differences between the blue Aja, the green Aja, and the red Aja, mainly because those are the Ajas that are represented by named characters that we spend any time with in the first season. Although in the hall scene, we do see the different Ajas and their representatives, but we get no explanation as to who they are, what their purpose is, what their goals are, what their raison d'etre is. And so, going to my rating system, because I love that this Wheel of Time Origins episode expands the scope of the White Tower visually, I gave it an 8 out of 10. Again, mainly for that scene of walking down the corridors, that corridor in the episode. In terms of interest, rated high again, 8 out of 10, because as a viewer, you see all these different Aes Sedai and seeming Ajas represented in that hall scene with no explanation as to what's going on, who these people are, why they are wearing different colored clothes than others. And so I think there's an interest, particularly given the emphasis that the show placed on the White Tower and Aes Sedai politics in the middle of the season. A high interest level in expanding on that, expanding the world building in that particular way. And so I gave it 8 out of 10 there. And then informative, gave it a 9 out of 10. And because I think that scene where the Amerlincy is telling the audience who these Ajas are, their differences, which is then certainly going to have an impact on speculation, I think, for audience members that haven't read the books about if Egwene and Nynaeve, as examples, become Aes Sedai, which Aja would they ultimately choose? The reason I don't give it a 10 out of 10 is because I did not see in the Origins episode an actual linkage between the color of the Ajas and their raison d'etres. So in the murals, we could see the colors depicted: red, blue, green, gray, yellow, etc., etc. But there's no actual dialogue linking the yellow Aja to healing, as an example. Maybe that's a nitpick. If it is, that's why I only took 1 point off. That's why I gave it a 9 out of 10. Either way, one of my favorite Origins episodes, one of the more important Origins episodes, I think, in my view, for the world building of the Wheel of Time, particularly the show, because I think it just adds so much more texture and detail to what we see in episodes 5 and 6. And then certainly going ahead, because Aes Sedai politics certainly are not going anywhere in the world of the Wheel of Time. But let's get to the final episode of Wheel of Time Origins in Ogier's Longing. And so this gives us a little bit of backstory on the Ogier. And I ultimately gave this a 1 out of 10 in terms of visuals. I didn't think it was that interesting. It felt very static, which I think does align or is very consistent with the focus being Ogier, as well as the narrator being an Ogier. So certainly the more static, pastoral, woodsy, foresty, deliberate pacing of both the dialogue and the animation fit with this perspective of the Ogier. So I like that thematically, but it still moved very slow for me. And I did get bored. In a 2.5, 3-minute clip, I got pretty bored listening to this particular episode of the Wheel of Time Origins, so that's why I gave it a 1 out of 10. That certainly reflects biases on my part. I want more dynamism, I suppose, more action. It is what it is. In terms of interest, I put this at a 1 out of 10 again. I personally am not that interested in the Ogier. I like Loial. And by the way, I think Loial is one of the best acted characters in the first season. Looking forward to seeing him again in season 2. I love Loial. And so I'm more interested in Loial and Loial's backstory than I am about the Ogier generally. Moreover, I think Loial's the vehicle to tell the story of the Ogier going forward. And so I think, again, just like the Greatest Warder episode, I feel like this could have been devoted to something else. Some other storyline, story thread, aspect, era of the Wheel of Time, more so than the Ogier. And so that's why, for me, it's a 1. I do rank it as a 7 out of 10 for the informative nature of it, because, again, I'm trying to look at that dimension through the eyes of a non-book reader. I think as a non-book reader, I would have almost no idea what in the world Loial is, why he's in Tar Valon, how he's different from a Trolloc, even though obviously aesthetically he's different. He has a full vocabulary of the common language in the world in which we're observing. So there obviously are markers as to how they're different. But outside of that, there's really no explanation as to who the Ogier are, their role in the story, and the like. And so I think from an informative perspective, this is actually information rich about the Ogier, if you're interested in learning more about the Ogier as a race and a society in the Wheel of Time story. But for ultimately, holistically, I wish they had focused on something else, whether that is maybe the fall of Malkir. There are rumors, as I understand it, that there was an Origins episode centered around Malkir and what happened to Malkir. So certainly that could have been something, a topic to talk about at this point. We also really don't get a whole lot of sense of the Shadow Spawn generally, the Trollocs and the Murdral, and maybe other Shadow Spawn that might be out there. So I was thinking maybe that could have been a really interesting topic for the 6th episode to talk about, well, where did these Shadow Spawn come from? Did they just emerge out of the ether? Were they created as they were in the book series? What was going on? And maybe during that Origins episode, in the background, we see other types of creatures we haven't yet encountered that are also Shadow Spawn, is kind of foreshadowing for what might come out and try to attack our heroes and our protagonists in the television show. I think there's so much more they could have done, and if this was supposed to correspond with the latter episodes, particularly episode 8, certainly there is a Shadow Spawn army attacking Faldera. So I think there is at least that thematic linkage to the latter portions of the first season. But ultimately they went with an Ogier's Longing. It was fine. Not my favorite. Not my least favorite, but it is basically at the same plateau as the Greatest Warder. But those are my general views and ratings of the first 6, the only 6, the current 6 Wheel of Time Origins episodes. And so that leads to this scoring of these particular episodes. So when I combine the ratings, how do they come out in the end? My top rated episode, The Breaking of the World. My second rated episode, The White Tower. We have a tie for my third and fourth rated episodes, which would be Saidin, Saidar, Stone, and The Fall of Manetheren. And then that's followed by An Ogier's Longing, and then rounding out the 6th, The Greatest Warder. To break the tie, I would actually put The Fall of Manetheren above Saidin, Saidar, and Stone, solely because, as I mentioned, Saidin, Saidar, and Stone felt like a lecture, and I just enjoyed more The Fall of Manetheren for the reasons I enumerated. But there you go. That is my ranking of the Wheel of Time Origins episodes in advance of Season 2 of the Wheel of Time. Please jump down into the comments below. First, let me know what you think of my 3 criteria. Do they make sense? Would you add criteria? Would you remove criteria? Would you reinterpret or redefine the 3 criteria I put together here? Also, what do you think of my rankings? What did you think about the Wheel of Time Origins episodes in general? Do you agree with the way I've rated them, the way I've ranked them, or do you disagree? How do you view the Wheel of Time Origins episodes? Join the discussion down in the comments below. I'm looking forward to hearing how each of you rate and rank the Wheel of Time Origins episodes as we all excitedly await the beginning of Season 2 of the Wheel of Time, only a few short weeks away. But if you like this video, please go ahead and give it a like. Also, if you're interested in any other kind of discussions about popular culture, whether that includes books, television, video games, conventions, the like, please consider subscribing to our channel. Here we talk and discuss all those different things in different formats, in different places. So we here at the Pop Docs enjoy discussing, analyzing, talking about popular culture in all of its manifestations. So if you want to join us, please hit that subscribe button down below. But for this video, the Pop Docs Clinic is officially closed.